My name is Lori Hanson. I'm a professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology, which is located in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. That is located in the middle of Canada.
Right. We'd like to ask you a little about what actually is social accountability and what is social accountability of medical schools in Canada and in your university as well.
Okay. I guess I'll start back with the WHO created a document in 1995 that talked about social accountability as the idea that schools of medicine around the world needed to become more responsive and more responsible socially for the kind of medical practitioners that they were producing. And they needed to think through how they could have physicians that were more accountable, more that thought about and maintained quality standards, that were thought about and maintained principles of equity in their practice and so forth. So they came out with this document in 1995. I think it was about, how many years later, 2004, 2001 perhaps, that the colleges in Canada, actually it was Health Canada that came up with the idea that Canadian medical schools should all be socially accountable. They adopted this idea, in other words, and then started to spread that idea to, we have 17 medical schools in Canada, and they started to ask schools to consider how to become more socially accountable. And so social accountability, I think there's an actual definition of social accountability, which is that, as the World Health Organization defined it, the obligation to direct the education, research, and service activities towards addressing priority health concerns of the community, region, and or nation they have a mandate to serve. Priority is a really important concept in all of this, and has been interpreted in different ways by different people, but one of the ways that priority is often interpreted in the province that I'm from, and in not only the school but the health district and so forth, is as those people in those populations in highest priority of need. So when this came down, this idea came down, there were already a number of people that were thinking about it, including in my institution, the Dean of Medicine. So that's sort of the beginning phases of how social accountability sort of was adopted.
Yeah, could you tell us about the partnership pentagram?
Okay. The WHO in their original document came up with the idea that if you think about a healthcare system being responsive to community needs as being the center of the pentagram, there are 5 different kinds of actors around that have to contribute to community responsive healthcare system. And those actors include, let's see if I can get this right, health policymakers, managers, health professions, academic institutions, and communities. And so those 5 actors all have an influence on the creation of and maintenance of a people-centered or community-centered healthcare system. So in order to be socially accountable, one of those actors is academic institutions. And of course, here we're particularly talking about colleges of medicine.
And how actually a medical school work together with the population? To identify the community needs, setting priorities, and so on. How actually it works?
Everyone would do it differently. So I can't speak for how different schools are interpreting this. And I think different schools in Canada are actually interpreting it slightly differently.
And your personal
experience? At the University of Saskatchewan, in the College of Medicine there, we had a Dean of Medicine who was a very progressive thinker, I think, and even before this document was actually adopted, he was already thinking about how the School of Medicine or the College of Medicine could be more socially accountable. So his first idea of how to do that was, him personally, he went out and talked to all kinds of people that were teaching in the College of Medicine, which is, in our case, both community-based faculty and academic faculty. And asked them about who might be interested in this concept and what else we might be able to do. And he did a lot of outreach to sort of figure out how things were working in the college when he came. And what he decided to do to sort of kickstart this was to call upon certain faculty that were already exhibiting kind of an interest in, or the way that they practiced, or the way that they framed their work as being kind of community responsive. And he got that group of people together in a committee. And that committee was charged with thinking about ways that the College of Medicine could become more socially accountable. And eventually, that was the early years. Eventually, there were a number of sort of, it's an academic institution, so we struck committees, and we struck a bunch of subcommittees around Aboriginal health, rural and remote health, immigrant and refugee health, gender equity, internationalization, and there are others I'm probably missing. But so he struck a number of these committees. He structured it into the overall idea of social accountability, and then each one of those, he gave them kind of free rein and liberty to try to figure out what kinds of things the college could do. And one of the things that social accountability kind of recommended fairly early on was to rethink, and I don't know who was, whether it came from someone within the committee or whether the committee responded, I don't know for sure, but one of the important things that I think happened was rethinking the admissions to the college. The admissions procedure to the college prior to this had been, the majority of, I think it was 60% of the grade or the way of evaluating medical applicants was to look at their grades. And if you had high grades, you're almost, much more guaranteed that you would get into medicine than if you didn't have high grades, because it's not direct for us. You actually have to do undergraduate work first, at a minimum of 2 years full-time study, and usually you have a degree of full-time study before you enter medicine. So based on that work, you'd have a mark, and that mark would assure you a place in the college, if it was good enough. High competition for a small number of spots and so forth. So he decided that, there was a recommendation that came that was approved by him to change the admission standards so that, in fact, only 40% of the weight that was allowed you to get into medicine was put on your grades, and the other 60% was through a process of what are called multiple mini interviews. And those multiple mini interviews are a number of different stations are set up that applicants go through, have a short time that they are evaluated on their response to some kind of problem that's put before them. And then what social accountability did is they created sort of a series of scenarios that were in fact about how those potential future physicians might deal with, for example, say a person who was suffering from drug addiction and was living in poverty and had many other issues that they were coming into a consulting room to what would be their response. And so a student, potential student would have to come up with a response to that. So it much more looked at the character of the person and their inclination to work with these priority populations. It looked at their not only their marks, which may or may not guarantee that you're sort of a person who's thinking about priority populations, or that you're concerned with them, or that you have an inclination for understanding and wanting to work around social determinants of health and so forth. So it was a much more, it became a lot more rigorous in terms of the qualification that a medical student would have to have. So by ensuring at the outset that you've got those kind of people coming into medicine, the hope is, or the thinking is, that person then going through medicine, when they get out of medicine, is going to be more inclined to want to work with priority populations, rural populations, remote, Aboriginal, inner city, and so forth, right? So that was sort of one of the things that the committee did overall that I think is, in hindsight, I think it's really important. It's still to be evaluated. It's not long enough at this point where we have some anecdotal evidence that in fact it is influencing that there are more students that are interested in the kinds of careers that put them into contact with, and they're more interested in community-based service and so forth. but we don't know. We haven't, it's not yet sort of been really documented. So those are the kinds of things, but that's the kind of thing that we sort of tried to implement to see if, and it kind of happened in parallel with the acceptance of this social accountability mandate.
And one last thing is, what actually is the community service learning strategy?
Well, that's another strategy that was also sort of, some of these things happen in parallel to the social accountability mandate, some of them happen because of it. So there was a thinking of, okay, if you want to have this more socially accountable position, you deal with the application or the admissions procedure, you also need to have ways of teaching that are going to keep students in contact with the communities that they are going to serve. So if you want them to be more responsive to the needs of community, they have to know the community. And as it is here probably, a lot of medical education happens in a setting that's university-based. At best, they're in clinical situations for bedside teaching, but very little contact with community members outside of that actually takes place. So the idea was for more and more of medical education to include service learning, and community service learning it's a pedagogical term that describes learning that takes place outside of institutional walls, usually in communities where the content of the learning is supposed to be designed or decided together with sort of the academics in the community, with an aspect of service attached to it. So some kind of, say volunteer service that's attached to that. And then what makes it learning and not just a volunteer activity is that you structure reflection activities into that so that at the end of each kind of community service that's provided by a group of students, there is a mentor or a tutor or a professor that sits with those students and reflects on the activities that they've done, tries to draw meaning from them and connect it with the theory that they're learning in class. So one of the curricular reforms that happened together with this was to increase the amount of community service learning and make it mandatory. It's not voluntary. Students have to do community service learning throughout their medical education at our college now. And they do that primarily in classes that are taught through our department, a lot of them, community health and epidemiology. And they do it in various different kinds of ways with various different kinds of partners. So that's sort of how one of the methods that you could kind of implement or think about implementing this big social accountability mandate is by thinking about who comes in, thinking then about how you teach them. What is less evident, and here's the critique, is that you haven't really worked with faculty, and I think this is the weak spot. That's my personal opinion, and again, it's not research-based, but being there and hearing what goes on. I think students are, as a body, sort of moving to be more questioning and more socially responsible in general. That's what we've heard anecdotally from community. But there's a lot of faculty that they're going to pass through, a lot of other teaching that's going to go on outside of these small excursions into community service learning, and they're going to pass by a lot of faculty that either don't agree with the mandate or don't find it relevant. And so they will teach the same way they've always taught. They will expect the same kind of student that they've always expected. And the hidden curriculum that exists and the culture of medicine and all that entails is going to continue to exist. And it's at odds, the hidden curriculum and that old curriculum and way of teaching and thinking that still exists amongst many faculty is going to be at odds with this new idea that they're trying to implement. So who's winning out in the end? We really don't know, because we haven't really done that kind of research yet. And we're anecdotally believing that in spite of all, there is still some kind of shift going on in the students that are coming out the other end, but we're not sure. And I think the weak spot, as I said, is probably faculty. It's the culture of medicine that's the problem. There's been other initiatives, and I think that's been the problem with that sort of has been the sticking point with those as well. So how well we're doing is not really known. The possibilities are there. But yeah, I'd say that's probably the weak spot.
Right. I think we're done. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Okay.